the Maine Judicial Branch.
And Paul.
Paul Nicholas, representing municipal interests from the city.
Have I missed anybody? I see Brenda's name, but I don't see her.
I'm here. Can you hear?
Thank you. If you could just introduce yourself briefly, Brenda.
Yeah, I'm Brenda Kelty. I'm the Public Access Ombudsman for the state of Maine, not a member of the committee, but an interested party. And just to let you know, I'm having some unstable internet connection. And so I'm having a little bit of problems, technical problems here. My video is not coming up, but
Okay.
I can hear you, so I am here.
Very good. Is there anybody on the call that I have missed? Good. So that actually went pretty well. Maybe we should just stop the meeting now, Peggy. The next item on the agenda, really the first item after introductions, is a review and discussion of the 14th annual report of the Right to Know Advisory Committee and the actions that have been taken in response to those recommendations. Peggy.
Hi, so welcome back, everybody. If I was just going to run through, or Colleen and I are going to just run through the recommendations that were included in the executive summary and let you know what happened to them. The first one was the all the public records exceptions changes that were recommended by the Right to Know Advisory Committee last year. The legislature did accept all those and they did become law. So those changes were enacted. They are not showing up online yet because the database, the statutory database has not been updated, but it will be soon. The next recommendation was to direct legislative staff to help identify non-standard language concerning existing public records exceptions. That was adopted by the Judiciary Committee, and it's part of Chapter 667, unallocated language, which directs our office, the Office of Policy and Legal Analysis, to work with the Revisor's Office, but also the Right to Know Advisory Committee for templates, basically, for standardized language. And we're supposed to be providing that to the Right to Know Advisory Committee next year.
Suzanne Goucher is joining us. Sorry. And Peggy, if I can just point out for people, if you want to follow this, that's on page I in the report. And that's up on the screen if you have the Right to Know Advisory Committee website open.
The next recommendation was to enact legislation to provide parameters on the use of remote participation by members of public bodies. The Judiciary Committee discussed that and decided not to go forward with a recommendation at that time, partly because the whole idea had been rejected in the first regular session. I don't know if it's irony or what, but that was enacted as part of the emergency legislation to allow, while an emergency is declared by the governor and 30 days after the termination of that emergency, to allow remote participation except by the legislature. The next recommendation was to enact legislation to cap copying. If anybody wants to ask questions about this, please stop me and we can talk about it then, or we can talk about it at the end. Enact legislation to cap copying fees. That was a recommendation that the Judiciary Committee supported. They adopted that as a committee amendment to LD 1575, which got reported out of committee after the legislature adjourned, so it's still pending. And that was the language that the Right to Know Advisory Committee recommended. The next one is enact legislation to require planning boards, specific school district officials, and additional municipal officials and their deputies to complete Freedom of Access Act training and to clarify the application of existing training requirements. That was adopted by the Judiciary Committee. The members, I don't think, had any problem with that. It was identified as a local mandate, and one of the options for the legislature to get mandated language passed is to fund 90% of that. And the Judiciary Committee decided they were going to do that. It took a long time, but the fiscal office came up with about a $33,000 fiscal note, and there would be a fund established within the Department of Administrative and Financial Services to help defray those costs that any kind of municipality incurs. That again was reported out of committee late or after adjournment, so waiting for a special session, which hasn't occurred yet. So that's still pending. The next one is actually a recommendation to Brenda Kelty, and hopefully she'll be able to update you on that request that the Public Access Ombudsman develop suggestions to enhance and improve training and develop methods for gathering data on requests and requesters. So I'll just skip that for now. Brenda can bring that up at her spot in the agenda if that works. Request that the Joint Standing Committee on Judiciary establish a study group to examine the use of emerging technologies with regard to making and keeping records, and to examine the use of communications technology during public proceedings. I think the committee decided not to go forward with that, and I'm not sure if that's something that Brenda has some comments on as well. The next recommendation was enact legislation to improve the review of public records exceptions by including consideration of access to information that will assist in making informed decisions about health and safety. The Judiciary Committee decided not to go forward with that recommendation. I don't remember there being a whole lot of discussion about it, but they chose not to go forward with that. The next one was enact legislation to expand the membership of the advisory committee to include a member with experience and expertise in data and personal privacy issues. The committee did sign on to that recommendation. The Judiciary Committee did, and that is pending before the legislature. And the next recommendation was enact legislation to revise the membership of the Archives Advisory Board and include a public member and 2 members representing journalistic and news perspectives. That bill was recommended by the Judiciary Committee. It was referred to the State and Local Government Committee because it's their jurisdiction to look at archives, and the Archives Advisory Board, which they had totally reworked in the first regular session. That bill was coming out of the State and Local Government Committee. It is pending as well. It was an ought to pass majority, ought not to pass. My understanding is the ought not to pass members just thought there needed to be some more time to figure out when the committee was voting on it, the state archivist had not been appointed yet. And so it wasn't that they were against that so much as they thought it was a little premature. But that bill is pending. The legislature has not taken it up yet. You wrote a letter. The next one was to request the Archives Advisory Board emphasize the publicizing of information about its meetings to enhance public awareness and participation. And you did write a letter to the Archives Advisory Board with that, that urging. You sent a letter to the Joint Standing Committee on Judiciary expressing issues that should be considered when dealing with surveillance videos. The Judiciary Committee decided they did not have the time or the expertise to deal with the public access issues of surveillance videos. So that, again, is on the back burner for everybody. And the Judiciary Committee decided not to take any action with regard to reporting of aggregate information concerning search warrants.
Thank you very much, Peggy. Before we continue, we had 2 people join us. I just want them to introduce themselves. First being Suzanne Goucher.
Suzanne Goucher, Maine Association of Broadcasters, representing broadcast interests.
Thank you and welcome. And Assistant Attorney General Phyllis Gardner.
Good morning. Phyllis Gardner. I'm here as the Attorney General's office designee, or Attorney General's designee.
And then I realized I never really introduced myself, particularly since we're on Zoom. We all know each other, but my name is Tom Harnett. I represent House District 83, which is Farmingdale and Gardner. And I serve on the Judiciary Committee, and I'm co-chair of the Right to Know Advisory Committee. Are there questions or comments based on what Peggy has reviewed, Judy? And we can use, if you raise your hand and I can see it, or if you use the raise your hand feature, I will do my best to get to everybody who has questions. So Judy.
Thank you. So the handful of bills that are pending, forgive my ignorance on the procedure here, but if this legislature does not come back into special session, what happens to them?
They go away.
They're dead. We'd
They're
have
dead.
to bring them back.
Right, which is, from this legislator's perspective, very discouraging. Because it's not just these bills. There are a lot of bills that are out there. And my understanding, and Senator Carpenter's been doing this longer than almost anybody in the state, he could probably tell me that it's as if they were never proposed, correct? They just die and wither. You're muted, Mike.
Given what you just said,
There
it's a
you
good thing. It's a good thing I was muted, but I think you're accurate.
Okay. And I've heard absolutely nothing about us being called back in to a special
I
session.
think that this close to the election, there's no way in the world it's going to happen. I suppose there's always a possibility of a lame duck session after the election, but I've not heard any rumor to that effect either.
Okay.
So, but I wouldn't say all is lost. If anything has been processed as a bill or an amendment, it really means that if somebody wants to resubmit it in the 130th, it's ready to go. And so I think a lot of committees have actually spent time trying to refine language and amendments, even though they don't think they're going to go forward in the 129th, because it means they can be ready to fly if and when the legislature will come in the 130th. I'm not sure the process or the procedure, but they'll be ready once the new legislature convenes.
And I think that's right. And I love the glasses half full analysis, Peggy. I appreciate the optimism. But it is true that bills that were worked, hopefully it eliminated a lot of the controversy about them and the process should be smoother. The flip side of that is we don't know who's going to be in the body, and we don't know what members are going to be on which committees. So, but I'll stick with the glass half full. Judy, did you have anything else?
Nope, that answered my question. Thank you.
Anybody else? One thing that I will add is, as Peggy pointed out, the irony that as soon as the pandemic hit, remote participation became this wonderful thing that everybody wanted. And I don't mean to make light of what brought us to that point, but I would be hopeful that the committee's recommendations will be taken more seriously moving forward, because people have seen that it works. I mean, it has its glitches, but it works. And, in many ways, it's easier to get a group of people like us here today when you can do it remotely and with total public access to that. So that gives me some optimism about that bill being brought forward for, I don't know how many times it's been now, but I think the boogeyman has been disarmed to some degree or discredited. Anybody else on anything that Peggy just reported out? Seeing none. And Brenda, did you say you had time constraints?
Thank you, Tom. No, I don't at this moment. I just can't get my video to come up, so I apologize for that.
Okay, well, I drew a little picture of you on my screen, so
Thank
it's as
you.
if
I hope it's a good picture. Tom.
I got your good side. Then if we could move on to new public records exceptions enacted and pending in 2020, Peggy?
Sure. So we for most of the session, the Judiciary Committee was doing the regular process of reviewing proposed public records exceptions statute requires. And when a committee sent one to the Judiciary Committee for review, I would send it out to the Advisory Committee so you'd at least kind of know that it was going on. What happened though was near the end in March, we got to the end where we knew we had 1 day left of session, and the powers that be would not let the Judiciary Committee meet because we were already working under some restrictions. And so there were a couple of bills that needed to be reviewed, and Representative Harnett volunteered to review those, to take the bills through the process on his own and then report to the Judiciary Committee with those recommendations. And the committee accepted those, and those bills were then enacted, or at least one of them was enacted. I think both of them were from HCIF, Healthcare Insurance and Financial Services. One of them was enacted right away. It was an emergency bill. I think the other one might be pending. Then there were 6, 7 other bills that the committees put forward to the Judiciary Committee after the adjournment in March. And so the committee did a remote review of them as well. Again, Representative Harnett stepping up and doing the heavy lifting of going through each of those criteria, submitting it to the Judiciary Committee, and the Judiciary Committee signing off on those. So if we had sent you the chart of all of them, you will see that most of those are still pending. There were a couple that were carried over from the first regular session. One of them was not enacted. One of them was held by the governor and then became law without the governor's signature. No, we knew that happened. So there really weren't that many that became law. So there won't be that many added to the public records database, public records exceptions database. But if you have questions about any of those in particular, I think I can answer them, and Colleen can answer the ones about healthcare, insurance, and financial services.
And just to give credit where credit is due, the heavy lifting was done by the staff of OPLA, really assisting me in working through the process with those bills and doing the review. So thank you very much, Colleen and Peggy, for that assistance, and for the salary bump that I got for doing all of those reviews. That was much appreciated. Any questions on any of that material? Okay. Then we can move on to item number 3. I'm sorry, number 4, Peggy.
Right, I'm going to let Colleen go.
Okay.
I'll take this one. We did share a chart with you by email, and it's on the website. And what it does is it shows you in outline form the next stage of public records exceptions that the Right to Know Advisory Committee is charged by statute with reviewing. And we've done in the past. Last year we started the second review of all of the titles, and we began with titles 1 to 7A. Those were enacted last session, and Peggy outlined that for you briefly about the recommendation of the advisory committee being carried forward by the legislature. So during this year through 2021, the advisory committee is asked to review the exceptions in titles 8 through 12. And so the chart outlines those exceptions that are in current law. I think there's about 68 or 69 of them. And what the chart really follows through is the process that you have used in the past. We typically start the process by asking each department or agency that's responsible for administering the public record exception to respond to a short questionnaire that's been developed and used over the years, asking their input for them to kind of review their experience with the exception and respond back to the advisory committee. Then the advisory committee then uses that as a basis for starting point really and foundation for conducting their review. Peggy and I have started that process, and we've sent out questionnaires to all of the agencies and departments that are noted on the chart. We've asked them to respond to us by October 23rd with the hopes that we'll get some email responses back, and the advisory committee, if you so choose, can start to get to work on reviewing some of those exceptions before the end of this calendar year. And then you'll also have an opportunity when after the legislative session, typically you'll have additional time during the next interim to review some of those exceptions. So that's sort of where we are in the process. The one thing that I think you'll get to talk about a little bit later in your meeting is sort of how you've approached this in the past has been through the appointment of a subcommittee. So you pull together a sort of a small group of your members that kind of takes the lead on doing the reviews, and then makes formal recommendations to the full committee that then the full committee can adopt as to whether or not they want the particular exception to remain in law, whether they would like to see some changes made, or whether the exception can be repealed.
Thank you very much, Colleen. And could you, I'm having a little difficulty flipping back and forth to the
Sure.
report, but that was a rather small committee that did that work the last time. Do you
It was.
recall the
It's-
members of that? I know Chris was on it.
Yep, I think Paul Nicholas was a member of that, perhaps Suzanne, and maybe let me see, I can pull it out of the report.
Thank you.
We listed the members of the subcommittee. So if folks are interested in continuing being a member of the subcommittee, that would be great. If that's what you want to sort of use as your process moving forward. We also love to have new members. So Chris Parr was the subcommittee chair. Paul Nicholas also served as a member, Julie Finn and Linda Clancy. So we had 4 members last time. We'd welcome more.
And I may have jumped ahead. We're going to address that when we get to
Yep.
subcommittees under item 6, right?
Right.
Okay. Any questions about that? And just so you know, it's very easy to find if you go to the Right to Know Advisory Committee website, which I learned about for the first time today. I must confess that it's right under forward reviews in 2020. You just click on it and it gets you right there. So thank you very much. The next item on the agenda is an informal update from Brenda Kelty, which I appreciate your volunteering to do this. So take it away.
So I was asked to just give a update. And usually when I do that as the ombudsman, I just talk a little bit about what I've been seeing, what kinds of complaints I've been getting, sort of generally, what I think has been going on out there. And of course, we've just gone through just an extraordinary change in the way that public meetings are conducted. And also just how agencies are responding to FOA requests under the circumstances with, lots of staff working remotely, or, people are not in the office, just all kinds of unanticipated difficulties. So I'd start with that, and then I just want to talk about having to do with data collection and training. And those were the things on my list today. So if there's something else, Peggy, please let me know if there's something else I should talk about. as we might expect, things got very quiet toward the end of March and April. And I got very few inquiries or complaints at that time. And not that there weren't all kinds of problems, because I think for the most part, all levels of government were not prepared for the sudden shift to remote meetings. And there was a lot of technical issues starting up. There was really, a lot of trial and error, I think, before agencies began to understand how best to use the technology that they had and how to design it to meet their needs better. So we definitely had a rocky start there. But people did a lot of sharing information, helping each other. I think I saw a lot of that, trying to get things to work smoothly. And then, I think that early in the summer, I was seeing sort of a normal amount of activity, and now I'm seeing a lot of activity. So for instance, I just went back and looked at the month of September. I've had 59 inquiries or complaints in September, which is a very high number for me. And I'm not exactly sure why that is, but there's definitely a lot of activity on public proceedings. And I think for the most part with the FOA requests, it's delay. It's just taking too long. And so those are the two areas that I'm seeing more activity in, but that was a lot. And my numbers for the last 3 months for July, August, and September are all high. So, my message to government agencies was, under the state of emergency, the government has a concentration of power. There's a lot of things that government is able to do that under an emergency order, they could not do. That's going to impact the daily lives of the citizens in their jurisdiction, and that those agencies should be prepared to be even more transparent, even more available, because they need to be able to show what they're doing. There would be, I would expect, an even higher bar in terms of transparency under those circumstances. So I started with that message. And the other reality, though, coming through this pandemic has been that, like I said, the offices are not staffed, people are working remotely, access to records is maybe not as easy as it is otherwise. And then the allocation of resources may have been shifted over to dealing with more that are more immediate. So there's definitely been a strain in terms of this, I think, reasonable expectation that there would be more questions, more FOA requests, more expectation of higher level transparency, and at the same time, maybe even fewer resources to address that. So one thing that I would say, I've been hoping that the agency's response to public access requests and public access to their meetings would be considered sort of, first of all, we know it's an essential core function of government, but I was very much hoping that there might actually be some money coming to agencies to accomplish that task, because under the state of emergency, it is absolutely critical. And I don't know that to my allocation of funds to help agencies better perform those functions under these circumstances. So that's one place where I really feel it is a good place to put some money, to make sure you've got staff in the office who can respond, or make sure that you've got the technical expertise available to ensure that the remote meetings are going smoothly. Or one area that we see a lot of difficulty on is our smaller municipalities, for instance, that may or may not have broadband, may or may not have good internet access. And we also have a significant amount of our population are really not computer savvy. And people go to meetings in person in the state of Maine. And we've got that segment that is not adequately addressed by the remote meeting format. And there have not been good, that's the area even at the point we're seeing some hybrid meetings where, for instance, the members are meeting in person, but the public is invited to listen remotely, or they want to invite the public, but they don't have enough space to do that pursuant to the COVID restrictions for social distancing. So we're still seeing those areas that would really need some resolution in the statute amendment that allows for the remote participation doesn't exact segment of the public meeting area that is still creating some problems, and would be something to talk about as you are looking at potentially proposing remote participation guidelines or some legislation, another piece of legislation. To what extent are you allowing in-person and remote at the same time? And how does that happen? That's just been one of the areas we've seen more problems with. But so like I said, in general, it's been very busy. And are there any questions about that?
Well, thank you very, very much, Brenda. And I'd like to open it up for questions. I have one that, a couple that pop up, Brenda. One, are you seeing more inquiries about municipal actions or lack of response than you typically did before, or is the split between state and local about the same?
I would say it's the same proportions. And as usual, because there are so many municipalities, I get a lot of contacts about municipalities, but I think that I've seen it on the state level as well. And generally, like I said, what I'm seeing is this difficulty of increased requests and fewer staff and fewer resources allocated to be able to address that. But I would say it's generally the proportions are about the same.
Thank you. And also just listening to, talking about the lack of ability for some people to access remote participation opportunities. We've learned a lot over the last 6 months about that. And I think one of the major, when we get to topics that this committee will look at in our upcoming meetings, I think that has to be one of them, is what have we learned in the pandemic about access, what does work, what are the challenges, and what do we need to, how do we overcome those challenges if we are going to make that the new norm, so to say.
Right. And when you get to that point, I'd be happy to summarize the kinds of questions that I've seen that might inform that analysis. See how to do that.
Great. Anybody else? Eric?
I couldn't figure out how to, on Zoom, how to raise my hand electronically. I'm used to Microsoft Teams.
I saw your hand, so that works too. Just put it up by your head and I'll see it.
So I just wanted to kind of build on what Brenda's saying. I'm in the state government Office of Information Technology, Maine IT, we call ourselves now. And so I can speak to state agency support for the executive branch. But since mid-March, it's been just a major kind of a sea change for us to attempt to support the remote working of all state agencies. I think I heard in the first couple of weeks, We deployed something like 700 laptops for people that didn't have laptops, that only had desktop computers at their, their workspace, and continuing beyond that first 2 weeks. I mean, and then beefing up our bandwidth for remote video meetings, doing training and promoting heavily the Microsoft Teams, as well as Zoom licenses, so that the agencies had 2 alternatives. But it was a major effort to try to do that, and I think agencies, because of the pandemic and having to, adapt, technology became very valued. But to Brenda's point, the learning curve of people is you can give them the tools, but they have to be able to learn or have the availability of training to make it easier for them to learn, and to be really fully functional. And not being in the office has been a real challenge also for people to be responsive. I've personally helped on, since that time, probably 40 FOA requests, and did my support remotely between March and September. There's probably been, easily 10 or 20 times that many FOA requests, but I only get involved in about 5% of them, 10% maybe. But I've had to adapt and be able to, remotely, help people either on the phone or do a session like this to help them be responsive to their FOA requests. So we're trying to, continue to be responsive, but it's, as Brenda says, it's been a major challenge in every way: technology, people, and process.
Sorry. Thank you, Eric. I forgot that I muted myself. Is there anybody else who would like to address anything that Brenda discussed? Okay, I then also want to recognize that we were joined by another member, Chris Parr, joined us when you were not here, Chris. We reappointed you as the chair of the Public Records Exception Subcommittee. That's what happens when you're late. But if you could just introduce yourself, since we're on Zoom and also YouTube, to the public. You're not muted, but I'm not hearing you. No. Let me look for your. It says you're not muted, but it lies. Okay, then moving on to a discussion of issues and topics to cover. And I know that some members of the committee, including Chris, or I hope we can get some audio on, raise some issues that he was concerned about that he wanted the committee to look at, as did Eric and Jim. So while Chris maybe tries to work on his audio, why don't I start with Eric? I know you sent an email in.
Yeah, just that I think it's been mentioned that as part of the executive order for the under the governor, which is restricted to 30 days at a time, that was well crafted, I thought, outlining the criteria for allowing remote participation in public meetings. But with each 30-day expiration of that executive order, then that expires, I think, 30 days after it's lifted. So that's a temporary thing, but I think that's a good template to, if that's worked well during this period, as attributed to Plato, necessity is a mother of invention. So either carrying that forward as that got laid out very succinctly in the executive order, and I think that's one of our attachments, or to bring back what we had recommended last year as part of an LD, where we laid out some guiding principles and some, criteria. Either of those two or a combination of those, I think is, the time is right, as you say, Tom, that, the people aren't as afraid of it or concerned about it as because they become accustomed to it. But just bringing that forward was the comment that I think probably myself and Chris wanted to bring forward. But let's get that back on the table, including the version from the executive order about the pandemic.
Okay, thank you. And Jim, you had raised some issues in an email as well.
Yes, and I will just add to what Eric was saying. One of the things that has come up in some cases of public meetings is that while, for example, the one that we're doing right now, while it is being streamed and people can watch, they cannot in many cases because of the technology comment. And so that is an issue I think that we would need to think about as we go forward. Once again, trying to point out that extending access to meetings at a distance is not a bad idea, as the recent situation has shown. However, it needs to be done in a way that provides full access. And so that's just tacking on to that other point. The point that the Freedom of Information Coalition has been hearing comments about has to do, and of course, I suppose it's somewhat been stimulated more by everything that's been going on lately in terms of reforming police departments and procedures and so forth around the country. But one of the things that might be worth considering for our group is what kind of access should there be in principle to complaints against police officers or departments, and how they're handled and what the outcomes are, because that is not by any stretch of the imagination a situation that is consistent across departments in the state. And so one of the things that there are here and there comments in various laws indicating that, for example, the outcomes, if there has been a decision made about some kind of a violation or whatever, that might be a public record. But for example, to the best of our knowledge, the fact that complaints have been made are not necessarily public records until there is an outcome. And so if there's 175 complaints, I'm totally making that up, of course, about a department or an officer or something, but for whatever reason, maybe even having to do with union rules in some of the larger departments, there has been no formal written decision about those. Nobody has any idea that that amount of activity has been occasioned. So anyway, just a way to think about that can be consistent across the state and that people can count on is something that might be worth our consideration. That's all.
Thank you, Jim. Chris, are you able to, can I try you again? Because I know you had sent in an email with at least 3 items that if your audio doesn't work, I can try to remember the best I can what they were. So I'm going to unmute you. Try it again. Whoops. Maybe you can unmute yourself. I seem to be struggling with my little cursor. Still Still can't hear you. Yes, Eric?
We have a chat feature, so maybe let's try experimenting with that. Chris maybe could use the chat, and then we could read out loud for the benefit of those on YouTube, whatever he wants to say in chat, just a suggestion, sort of a poor man's workaround.
Okay. As you're typing, I don't know how quickly you type. If this was me, it would take a very long time. But I do recall that you raised at least 3 issues. One we've covered being remote access. The other was payment of the hourly charge for responding to a FOA request. And the third one, and I don't think it was in this order, had to deal with corner caucuses, an item that I didn't realize was an issue, because we do those. And I know it's going to be tough to type a lot of that, but does that, maybe with a nod of the head, summarize the 3 issues that you raised? Okay. And maybe as we move forward with additional meetings, we can put those on. I mean, there's some weighty issues that have been identified that I think we, as a committee, need to address in the preparation of our next report, which we are still obligated to do. Correct, Peggy? Okay. Oh, I see there's something in the chat. Julie says that sometimes logging out and logging back in will cure audio problems. Might be worth a try, Chris.
Nope.
He's gone. So we'll see what happens when he comes back. In the interim, are there other issues that other members of the committee have that they would like us to focus on as we move forward in completing our duties for 2020? And if you just stick your hand up in the screen, I'll call on you. Amy?
I may have missed it from Peggy in the review, but I am curious as to where things ended up with the question of surveillance video from schools and by extension school buses and community programs being accessible to the public, where that all ended. Because I think that the last hearing on that was like maybe a week before the shutdown. So that's my question, and obviously I think it is an important issue.
And you're talking about, Amy, not just we talk about school buses, but also what's happening in the hallways, what's happening in an after-school.
Yeah, it was the schools,
library.
The first iteration of it was about schools, and then there was discussion about extending it, broadening it to buses and community, any community municipality buildings that were frequented by children.
And I know that Paul raised some questions about parks and rec programs, et cetera. Could you refresh or at least my recollection of where that ended up? Nothing moved forward.
So the advisory committee last year, part of the problem was you no longer had a member representing school interests, because Marianne Lamar had to resign because she was no longer part of the school entity that she had been appointed from. So part of that was you weren't getting the full participation on that subject matter. And but you did write a very lengthy letter raising all the issues, because I don't think the advisory committee was actually in one place. You had a lot of concerns. I think you all recognize the same concerns. Didn't have a single recommendation to go forward. The Judiciary Committee received that letter. They had a bill that they had carried over, and they realized that it was a much more difficult issue than that simple bill was going to resolve. And they recognized that they did not have the time to handle it. So it's kind of been put on hold. And if you want to try to take it up again and try to focus on maybe narrower issues to move forward, or keep it broad, it's certainly up to the advisory committee to take it up, discuss it, and make recommendations.
Thank you, Peggy. Julie.
Yeah, I was just wondering, what is the status of the new appointments? Are we likely to get a school representative soon?
That's always a good question. And we sent you the list, so you knew that there are 2 current vacancies, one law enforcement, and one is the school. And in addition, a lot of your appointments were made longer than 3 years ago, and you're still part of it until somebody replaces you. But it might be a good idea maybe you can talk about whether the advisory committee wants to approach the appointing authorities and remind them how important it is to have active members of the advisory committee.
And certainly,
I haven't heard anything. Other than that, I haven't heard anything from any of the appointing authorities.
and certainly with all interests represented. I mean, particularly when you have an interest like schools, that's a critical piece. And I just went back to it was the second letter that was attached to our last year's report that addressed the issue of the schools and public access, correct, Peggy?
Yes, right.
And doing that without a member representing that interest, I think is fraught with peril. Jim?
Yes, hi. I just wanted to let you know I'm going to have to drop off here. And so I just didn't want you to think it was a failure.
Okay.
But I have an 11 o'clock, so I have to.
Well,
drop
you will be appointed chair of some subcommittee, but we'll be in touch as to.
I'm fully anticipating that.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Other issues that people would like to see us take on as we move forward with additional meetings, which will be happening because we're statutorily obligated to have 4, correct, Peggy? A minimum of?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, good. You don't know how many people probably wish in real life they could do that to me.
Well, I can do it right now, so be careful.
Hi, everyone. It's great to see you all. The only thing, my name is Chris Parr. I represent state government interests on the committee. The only thing I would add is not so much as something to explore, but something that I guess I've given thought to. I think one valuable way that we as a committee can work is to be advisory and give recommendations in some cases, not necessarily do a deep dive into a particular topic or try to write legislation or whatever, but just give guidance or what we think is advice on public policy matters. What I would want as 2 recommendations are one, that we recommend as a committee that a Maine Privacy Act of some kind be developed and implemented with an effective date that allows for plenty of years for compliance. And I would also say that I think given privacy issues that are so common nowadays and that are just going to become more common, I think it's actually we're at a point where having a privacy committee like the Right to Know Advisory Committee would be worthwhile to have. So those would be the only other 2 recommendations that, or topics, if you will, that I would recommend. And those are as simple as making those recommendations if the committee supports them. So.
Did I accurately describe the other 3 that you had?
You did, yes.
Okay. Anybody else? And I'm looking for hands. Eric.
I just wanted to emphasize what Chris just said about those proposals. I know we struggled over that last session, didn't have consensus, had polarizing opinions, but I would like to volunteer to help with anything along those lines if the committee decides to pick those up, to have a full discussion and vetting of those.
Thank you. Appreciate that. And I know that there were strong feelings articulated last year, and the best way to resolve those is to deal with it and not put them off. Anybody else? So Peggy, we need to discuss how to move forward logistically, what we're going to do. We have, I think, a lot of issues that have been raised. If we can get those summarized in some form of a memo about what we talked about today, and then look at what sort of subcommittees we will need to address those. I think we have, Colleen mentioned the members of the subcommittee on the public records exceptions from last year. Are there other people who might want to help with that lift? I think there are only 4. Is that right, Colleen? And I don't know if the number of bills or statutes we need to review this year is higher or lower than it was last year, or is it about the same?
It's about the same. It's a little bit lower than last time,
Okay.
but right around the same range. Yeah.
Okay. Paul.
I was just going to say, I'm now, my role has changed in the city. I'm now the city attorney as opposed to the assistant city attorney. And I'm finding there's quite a bit more to do. So I don't know that I'll have time to do that same review that we did last time. So we may be down to 3 people on that committee as it is.
Okay, so be careful what you wish for. You got the promotion. But yes, Eric, and then Chris. Eric, Eric, you can.
Yeah, I'll defer to Chris first.
Okay, Christopher.
Thanks. Paul, congratulations. I think I'm the chair, if I remember right, of this for a few minutes ago.
Recently reappointed. Yeah.
Yes. So I'm not. I actually meant to make one other comment when I was speaking earlier, and that's that I know I read Jim's recommendation for a topic, and I would think it would be very important to have someone, the unfilled vacancy representing law enforcement interests, to be on the committee if we're going to discuss that topic. That's all I have to say. Thanks.
Okay. Eric?
Yeah, I was just going to say, if need be, I can help. I didn't help last year because I was on 2 other subcommittees and didn't think it'd be right to be on a 3rd. But in past years, and my 4 past years, I think I was on that probably 3 times. So if need be, I can help with that. And I was looking ahead at, even though there's a large number, there's only a small number of groupings. Like there's, a dozen items for the Gambling Control Board and a dozen items for something else. So there's really not that many variety of topics. So I think we could churn through it pretty quickly.
Okay.
If need be, I'll jump in on that.
The question for Peggy and Colleen, perhaps a memo to the full committee of what the subcommittees that we generally have, and to see which members are interested in which committees, so we can construct those moving forward. Is that doable?
That's certainly doable. I think you've kept your subcommittees flexible to be responsive to whatever the topics are that you choose to focus on.
Okay. So maybe I'm putting the cart before the horse then. You're saying that we need to get our areas of focus, and the
right.
subcommittee will flow from that.
Right. I think that's if you want to identify what you want to work on. I don't know if that's best in a discussion like this. Then you go away and you think about it, and then you respond by email. I think it makes, to me, it makes sense for you to figure out what you want to focus on now. And in addition, some other issues that were raised by a member of the public were the fact that and I've actually worked with Brenda with a particular requester actually looking for more than freedom of access help. But the question is, what does somebody do when an agency is not being responsive to them? Right now, really, you can talk to Brenda, and if she can't make things happen, you go to court. And I know that in the past you talked about, is there some kind of medium remedy there? Is there some other remedy? And I don't know if that's something you want to try to pursue again, but that is something that had been raised by the email that we shared. So I guess I think it would be easier for you if you figure out what you want to work on. If you want to do that after you end your meeting and you think about it, and you can kind of weigh in and say, here are the things that are most important to me to be able to do in this kind of odd electronic remote process. And then you can figure out who and maybe that's what you do, is you have people raise their hand via email about what they want to work on. And then that's how we set up the subcommittees. However, I think you can be creative and flexible, and however you want to go forward, Colleen and I can support you in that.
Okay. Eric.
So it's kind of a difference between things that are on the agenda for the full Right to Know Advisory Committee, which we just kind of churn through, like remote participation that we've already brought up. The question is, do we really need a subcommittee to dive deeper into certain topics and then bring those, the benefit of our struggling with that and recommendations to this full, advisory committee or not? Or do we just handle it in the 3 or 4 meetings that we have as an agenda item? The exceptions has been already designated as a subcommittee because that's a lot of detailed review. But the question on those other topics, should those be peeled off as a subcommittee or really just vetted to this full committee, which also is, broadcast on YouTube to the general public?
It's a good point. I think that, I see 2 sides of it. One, we've generated a list based on the various emails of 6 or 7 issue items. So it's hard for me to figure out where I rank those right off the bat, but I clearly remote participation and what we have learned about it during the COVID-19 year, please not be years, I think certainly has to be one of the top items that we address. And I'm comfortable addressing that as the entire committee because I think it's that important. One of the things I heard Brenda talk about that strikes me as very important is what have we learned about FOA and how it works during a pandemic when bodies are not in their offices with access to the records that people have the right to obtain. That to me is a pretty large issue. And I would see that, again, I'm going to ask for Peggy and Colleen to put out a survey of some sort. I would see that as a large group issue. The others I'm not certain about. Paul?
So my recollection on some of these issues last time was we had a big extended debate in a subcommittee, and then we got back to the full committee and we kind of had to repeat the big extended debate And of the issues that have been brought up, and I'm afraid I didn't write down a list of them, but it seemed like most of those issues are the sorts of things that they're not technical things to work through. They're more just big policy questions. So I feel like we may just end up overall taking extra time and not getting a whole lot out of sending them to subcommittees.
Okay, right. Which goes to that, I think Eric's point about bringing them to the large group rather than telling the story twice and still ending up without a resolution. So, Julie.
Yeah, I just think, and we've touched upon this, but Chris mentioned that the lack of a law enforcement member with respect to the citizen complaints issue that Jim raised before he signed off, and Amy raised the school surveillance issue, and we're also lacking a school member. I think it's tough to do either of those without those members. And I think I don't know how long it'll take to replace or to get those members. And I know those are both very current, very big, very important issues. But with slots specifically designated for those subject areas, it seems like it would be hard to go forward.
Peggy, if the committee authorizes it, am I allowed to ask you to draft a letter to the appointing authorities from me on behalf of the committee requesting that those positions be filled post haste?
Sure, we would be happy to do that.
Is there general consensus from the committee without, if we could shake their heads and if anyone really wants to do that? Okay, I'm seeing like those little dolls that are on the dashboards of cars. I would take that as a yes, Peggy. Oh, and Judy's showing off with the thumbs up emoji. Very well done. So I guess what I think we've identified some large issues that we need to address as a committee. We have identified the need to get the committee complete with the areas of expertise that we are missing and the voices that have to be part of those discussions. But there were a host of other issues, and I would still like a list, a sort of a survey to be circulated to the committee to find out what the areas of focus would be and whether or not they are technical and would benefit from a subcommittee. And if not, let's just start to work on it. So I would ask that we do that and also begin the process. If you could send out a polling about meeting dates, I'd like to schedule our next 3 meetings if possible, knowing that a lot of things are subject to change, but the earlier we get them into people's calendar, the better chance we have of getting together. Is that doable, Peggy and Colleen?
Yep.
Does anybody else have, is there anything else you wanted us to take care of today, Peggy or Colleen? Up, and I'll get to Judy. Let me get to Judy first. Go ahead, Judy.
So it seems we have no choice but to deal with remote participation. And I wonder, since our time is short, if we should get some feedback from MMA before we even start discussing it, how it all went among their membership or any other agencies that might want to weigh in, what the obstacles were, because when the emergency order ends, and I sincerely hope it ends, unless we do something, it's going to revert back, to the old school way. And I think there's going to be a lot of confusion. So I would just like to know how it's gone on their end.
Okay. What's the most efficient way to do that, Peggy and Colleen? Is it a letter from me to MMA? Or is that something you can just reach out to them on behalf of the committee?
I would think that, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't think that has to be formal. And I don't know if Eric or Brenda or even Chris, as all, state and kind of representatives, able to collect any feedback or any ideas on how we can collect feedback from state agencies about how it's going. Eric's going to help us with that.
Yeah, he's got his thumb up.
And Peggy, this is Brenda Kelty. I'd be happy to talk to the attorneys that represent agencies to get their perspective on what were do that, state agencies.
Okay.
Just want to show I can do these little clappy things too. Christopher.
Yeah, I was wondering, Judy, I'm intrigued by your thought that things are gonna, once the order's done, might revert back to the old school way, I think is how you put it. I'm curious as to, and I don't mean to prolong the meeting much, but I was wondering if you could explain why you think that. That intrigues me. I know that I'm using technologies that I never used before and that I fully intend to keep using after I'm done, because saves me an hour traveling. It saves me, it's very convenient. I can see people as opposed to just talk on the phone with people. So I foresee for myself anyway, continued use of some of the technologies. So I didn't know if like what's making you think that. I'm just curious.
Well, I sincerely hope that we can go forward in the same way, but because the law is silent on government bodies, they may be forced to go back to old school because of that's how it was before, without any language that changes it. So I think that's going to be really confusing for them and probably incredibly inefficient. So if there's any way that we can aid agencies to continue this going forward, like in an emergency, I think this is emergency legislation.
Right.
Move this forward.
Right. So the statute that authorizes remote participation authorizes only until 30 days after the emergency it expires or terminates. And so relying on that, in fact, it might even have a self-repealer in it. So relying on that new section 403A won't be any good 30 days after the emergency ends. So I think the idea is to put something like that in statute somehow to support remote participation rather than having the law silent. Yeah.
I saw hands up from Eric first, then Chris, and then Paul. So Eric.
I'll defer to the other two. Go ahead.
Chris.
I think you're absolutely right, Judy. I hadn't thought about that. And I guess I would just comment in this way. As we've been working on this for years now, there's always been, at least the sense I have is that, and certainly in my mind, there was always this question as to, has the legislature spoken in some way to this? You know, is it authorized implicitly? Is it not? And as I think someone called it once, it's the Wild West out there because of this disagreement. I think that with the enactment of this emergency law, that implies to me that the legislature feels, if not just implies, but actually says in a way, that the legislature feels as though this type of way of conducting meetings is not authorized under FOA. Therefore, we need this emergency legislation to authorize it. So I think that that's, in my mind, certainly it gives, I don't know if the legislature intended that to be a policy statement in some way or what have you, but I think it's something that I am considering going forward as I think about this issue. So.
And Paul, and then Phyllis.
Just a couple of notes on that, the law, which I haven't had pulled up in front of me. It does have a self-repealing provision 30 days after the termination of the state of emergency. There is, to your point right there, Chris, there is something about it says notwithstanding any provision of law or municipal charter provision or ordinance to the contrary. So I think you could still make an argument that the idea was to sort of clean away anything that might be there, whether or not it is. I'm of the opinion that if we're going to do remote participation, we should have a law that allows remote participation. So I don't know that I would buy that argument, but there is still an argument there. The third thing is just for our own purposes, I don't know if for the city of Bangor, the way that we've been handling this is anytime we have a body meet for the first time, we actually, that body makes a determination under the law about how we're going to participate. I don't know if we've done that with this particular body. And also if we end up doing any official votes, those do have to be by roll call. I don't think we've done anything really official like that yet, but for the future.
And Phyllis.
Yeah, I was just going to, I agree with what Paul just said. I think that, you know, what's authorized during this emergency is for the entire membership of the public body to be meeting remotely, which I think is a little bit different than what some agencies have done in the past, which is have a physical presence in a public space with people able to attend, and then have some members participating by video feed or audio. So, but I think, as Paul said, that notwithstanding, it was just to capture, you know, to the extent this was prohibited, they wanted to make clear it was allowed during the pandemic at least. So, but I totally agree with all the comments people have made that we really need to have a statute in place.
I mean, best to eliminate any confusion or argument. Here's how you do it. Here's what you do. Here's how you do it. Okay. Eric.
So if Jim Campbell were still here, I wanted to reflect what he said at the beginning of the meeting, that while this works well for us among the committee, that we can, you know, share back and forth, the public is not able to participate other than to just passively listen. So it kind of simulates that we're in the judiciary hearing room, and that if there was any public, they would be silently just you know, listening, but not able to be called to make comments, like you might selectively say, oh, you're here in the audience, would you like to come forward? That's not possible, and with this format, they're not able to chat or even get to us anything. So that's probably what we'll need to kind of hash out when we come forward with our recommendations, as to, you know, the public can fully listen, but only passively.
Among other things that we'll have to figure out. And one of the things I wrote down when Jim was speaking, and I'll get to you then, Linda, was watching is not participating. You know, the ability to sit and watch us do this is not a public process. It's not participation. So we certainly have to get to a better place to allow that. Linda.
Yeah, I was just going to echo that. That was my concern as well, is the right to know committee. How is the public watching us? Are they watching through YouTube? Are they able to comment on YouTube, and who's watching those comments and who's relaying them to us? And then secondly, the chat function, can the public see the chat function, or should we eliminate the chat function for that purpose?
I don't know what you see on YouTube. But I suspect there's not a way to, I'm not seeing any questions coming in.
Right. So I think this is from our experience with legislative committees, because we don't monitor the chat function on YouTube, and it's kind of disingenuous to allow it there, because people think, members of the public think somebody's reading those messages and those questions and those recommendations. It's actually the legislature has disabled the chat function for any of the broadcasts on YouTube, just because we don't have the capability of following that. If there's another way to go about it, great. I mean, I think it sounds like a good discussion topic for all of you.
Julie.
I think there must be a way to allow public comment. And I mean, I'm not super familiar with Zoom, and I don't know if it's like someone emails Peggy and asks to be sent a Zoom link. Sounds like Paul might know, but I was just going to point out that I've been, listening in on the Maine Commission on Indigent Legal Services meetings, which they also used to meet in the Judiciary Committee room, and they're doing them by phone, and they take public comment at the end of every meeting. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
Paul, I saw your hand up.
Thanks. I think this is something we can get into later. There are other ways. There are Zoom ways of using Zoom where you have some people as panelists and everyone else as an audience, and they can request to speak. Some of those have limits on the number of people who can do it. It might be 100 people or something like that. There are methods out there that we can get into, and I think that one of the things that the laws was passed did pretty well was it said, here is what we need your method to be able to do. And then, whatever method works. We're not going to say you have to use Zoom or you have to use something else. We might need to tweak some of that. And I have a couple of suggestions about that for when we get into the nitty-gritty of it.
Okay. Anybody else with pressing concerns before we close up and review next steps, which, Peggy, as I hear, will be circulation of the list of items that were raised, recognizing that some have already risen to the top, and then secondly, establishing or finding out who's interested in the existing subcommittees, and perhaps most importantly, scheduling 3 more meetings before the end of the year. Which I know is a fun process when you have lots of different people with lots of different schedules. But and you and I and Colleen, we can offline talk about how that might look, so we're not just saying what can you do over the next 3.5 months, because obviously it's not going to work if we do that. Does that make sense? Okay.
Sure, that makes sense. So hopefully you can all monitor your email, because we'll be putting that together and sending it to you. And I don't know if there's anything else, if there's a better way to do this, let us know.
Thank you, Peg. Thank you, Tom.
Okay. Anybody else? It's nice to see everybody on Hollywood Squares here. So appreciate the time. Take care.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Peggy. Thanks, Colleen.
Thanks.
Well, I'm a host. I get to watch everybody leave. Almost everybody.
I'm leaving.
Thank you,
Okay.
Roy. Yeah, me too. Bye.
Okay. We'll see you. Thank you, Roy.